I'm Ernie Chambers, and today it's going to be something like verbal hopscotch. Everybody probably is aware of the way that America must hightail it out of Afghanistan after 20 years. But for somebody to try to say that President Biden is responsible for all of this, and this is from sports, and in Nebraska, people are hung up on sports when Nebraska plays. It would be like a quarterback getting hurt with 2 minutes left. In professional football, when there are 2 minutes left, an automatic timeout occurs. So a man who practices quarterback, but had never been in the game, was suddenly called off the bench, told, put your helmet on, get ready, you gotta bail us out. And when he gets a puzzled and troubled look on his face, the coach says, I know we're 30 points behind, but I believe in miracles, and I think you're a miracle worker. Now go out there and work a miracle, but if you don't, then you're off the team. It's ridiculous, as complex as world events are, as up and down and around as the Afghanistan issue has been for 20 years. It's preposterous to think that Joe Biden can come in after the one before him, Donald Trump, had made a quasi, at least, agreement or arrangement with the Taliban. And when those things begin to come apart, say that whoever is sitting in the chair as president is going to be held accountable for everything that happened before he got there. I am not a devotee of any white man. I'm not against every white man, but as a Black man who's been in this world 4 years, I have learned, and it was a long time ago, that I had better rely on number one, which is myself. So I am looking at this, I believe, objectively. Even though I predicted when Bush first got America into that war, that they were going to meet the fate of the superpowers, Russia and others before, the French, and America would meet the same fate. Even at that early point, Afghanistan was known as the graveyard of superpowers. So I said the same thing that happened to them will happen to America. White countries go in there with no respect for the people, have no concern about how many civilians are killed, how much of the physical infrastructure of the country is destroyed, how much of the governing structure is destroyed, because they can take out and run whenever they choose. Well, running time came and Biden was given the stick. Now I'm going to go to a track analogy. They have what they call the 4x400 meter relay. It used to be called the mile relay. There are 4 runners. The first person to run is called the lead-off runner. The last one to get the stick is the cleanup person. So the first 3 are important. But for any slack that has come, by the time the cleanup man or woman, if it's women running, gets that baton, that person is expected, and if not expected, prayed for, to make up for all of the flaws that happened before and make the team a winner. If that cleanup person gets the baton ahead of everybody, generally he or she can maintain enough of a lead to win. Occasionally, somebody will get it a yard or 2 behind and be able to make up that short distance. Even more rarely, somebody may be as much as 10 yards behind, but it's meters now, and somehow manage to put the pedal to the metal, hold that speed for the full 400 meters and win. Biden is not that kind of runner. Biden is a typical white man. He is facing what happens typically when white men are in charge of a complex issue that involves non-white people. First of all, those non-white people are not accorded full humanity. So they're looked upon as things. Well, now that big airplane took off 1 or 2 minutes before the deadline and left everybody in its way. Some Americans, many people who were of Afghan origin who had helped America foolishly or out of desperation. They're left to their own fate, and we'll just have to see what happens. But all we will do is either look the other way. If you're somewhat sensitive, you will be regretful. If you are deeply spiritual, you might say this is what God planned. But if you're an ordinary down on the ground person like me, you will look at what they're confronting, be sorry that it's them, but glad it's not me and my children, and hope against hope that somehow they will survive this intact. But if they do, America will not have had anything to do with that aspect of it. Speaking of military matters, your last president, those of y'all who were Trumpites and still are, have a man who ran out on his country. He was rich, a spoiled brat. His father was the one who built a real estate empire and left money to Donald Trump, who squandered it. There's a verse in the Bible, as you all say, for almost everything. And one of them said something to the effect, when a rich man dies, how will he know whether he leaves his wealth to a wise man or to a fool? Well, old man Trump may have known that Donald was a fool because he had been around him long enough. But like a lot of white men who are fathers, he may not have paid much attention to him and just hoped that he had absorbed enough, if by osmosis or soaking, to take over and at least not squander everything that the old man had built. Well, when the Vietnam War came along, Donald learned one thing: self-preservation, avoid any pain and all pain at the expense of whoever else might suffer therefrom. So he developed a mysterious and rare foot problem. His heel hurt. And that's probably because when he took off from the starting line, he twisted something, pulled a ligament, a tendon, but he didn't have to go to the military because he had a foot that hurt him. I have never worshiped this American flag. I referred to it in the legislature as a rag. When white people pretended or affected outrage, I said, well, wait a minute. Would you expect a Jew who sees the swastika as a symbol of Nazism to get choked up and tearful when that swastika is put on a piece of cloth, hung on a board or a stick or a pole and hoisted into the air? I pointed out that every problem that Black people have, all those we have had, as Frederick Douglass said, the greatest curse for a Black woman was beauty, physical beauty. He had seen Black women raped. He described in his autobiography how one woman was raped. She was not going to go along with the so-called master. So he tied her hands, her wrists together after putting them over a limb. She was tied so that her toes barely touched the ground. He stripped her to the waist, let people watch, and laid into her back with a cowhide whip. And at first she tried to take it without complaint. Then she began to scream. She began to beg for mercy. And it seemed that the more she begged, the more screaming she did, the more pain that was inflicted, the harsher became his sadistic activity, typical brave white man. Psychologists and psychiatrists have said there's a profound, deep connection between sadism, that is, inflicting pain on others, and sexual arousal. And that's what was happening. Thomas Jefferson, who is supposed to be such a great man, actually bred, that's the term they use, B-R-E-D, bred slaves for money. When the children were born, they were sold at auction. Sometimes there was like a consignment. If somebody liked the way the mother-to-be looked and the father would sire the child, they would make an arrangement before the birth to get first dibs at on that child. That's the way we were treated. That attitude exists and persists today. The only reason I'm not wearing chains is because I won't tolerate it. I will not let anybody take away my dignity. Anybody can take my life. It probably was Oscar Wilde, because he was the one who made such observation that a half ounce of lead can change the history of a nation. Where's that effect? In other words, that's how much a bullet weighed. There's a guy called Archduke Franz of Serbia. And when he was assassinated, it was the beginning of one of those wars that, since it involved white people, a world war. You never know what craziness these white people are going to bring about. When there were none of them in this hemisphere, there were not the diseases that now exist. In America, they did not have wildfires. The forests were more burdened. They were denser because the native peoples knew how to live with nature and respected it. One of their members said, when they talked to him about the fires out in the western part of the country, the floods, the tornadoes, he said, when you offend against Mother Earth, she will punish you. Mother Earth is offended, and her punishment is being reaped, and there's nothing you can do about it. And the difficulty is that some of the ones who inflicted the hurt on Mother Earth are long gone. The native people knew about controlled burning. There never was a wildfire. No forest ever burned to the ground. No species of animal was ever even close to extinction. Nothing was killed for the sheer love of killing, as white men do with high-powered guns and call it hunting. When they hide in a blind, as they call it, try to dress in such a way that the quarry will not be aware of them. Then if it's duck hunting, when the ducks come where this guy knows they're gonna come, he shoots them, and if he gets one, he's a great hunter. That is something that bespeaks the cruelty, the lack of humanity, and to my way of thinking, all these white men who hunt. Ernest Hemingway was not a great hunter. He was a butcher, just as are those who would like to be able to shoot the few mountain lions living in Nebraska. Didn't I tell you this was going to be something like verbal hopscotch? Well, now let me hop to something, and I'm going to read from a document which thousands of men and probably now thousands of women have received, but not your president, those of you all who love Donald Trump. Across the top, in an arc, in large, fancy lettering, honorable discharge. Beneath that, centered, is an eagle. Under the eagle, from the Armed Forces of the United States of America. And it says, this is to, it's kind of in script. This is to certify that PFC, parenthesis E3, Chambers Ernest W, BR, that's not for Brown, 17499941. That's a semi-prison number. Was honorably discharged from the Army of the United States on the 12th day of July, 1963, 2 days after my birthday. This certificate is awarded as a testimonial of honest and faithful service. Signed, Jack T. Young, Colonel, AGC, whatever that stands for. I took my basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And I didn't know after whom that place was named. I may have mentioned this during one of these programs. In 1919, when these racists in Omaha lynched William Brown, a man so arthritic he could scarcely move, allegedly for raping a white woman while holding a pistol on the man she was with. They took him to the courthouse, put him in the jail, which was on one of the upper floors, notified people that they caught the rapist. He'd been identified by the victim and the man with her. A crowd of between 5,000 and 15,000 people, I guess they didn't count well in those days, surrounded the courthouse. They stormed the building, but there were some with other fish to fry. They had been notified where certain documents were stored related to real estate, financial transactions, all kinds of things that created legal obligations for some people on one hand, legal liabilities for others. All those files somehow disappeared. There were some officers connected with the sheriff's department who I suppose took seriously their oath to uphold the law, and they did what a few could do against many to try to prevent them from taking this man out. Naturally, they failed. And to make a long story short, they dragged him out of the cell, and as they passed him down the stairs to others, he was beaten, he was spat upon in the typical white Christian American manner. And when they got him outside, there was a light post. Some people call it a lamp post. There was a white mayor whom a corrupt political machine didn't like. So they strung him up, but somebody cut him down before he died. Not so with Will Brown. They shot him while he was hanging. Then they mutilated his body, tied him behind a police car. Even in those days, the police were our ISIS. Dragged him through downtown, took him to some railroad ties that had been constructed, I guess, by one of the top architects of the day, soaked it with gasoline along with his corpse, put it on, and there's an iconic photograph of that burning. A smoking corpse, partially burned, white people standing around, grinning like baboons, cavemen, the slow-headed, even a couple of kids, one guy with a military uniform, and that was white Christianity in action. Martial law had to be declared. Fort Omaha existed then, but help was needed. On 24th and Lake, a machine gun was set up, not against the white rioters, as they were called, the murderers, but on the possibility that Black people would become so outraged that they might try to retaliate in some manner. So the machine gun, if it was to protect the Black community, should have been set up where the white people were. A general came and he took charge. He started rounding up the ones who could be identified from photographs because they were proud of what they had done, these people. They didn't take, in those days, selfies, but they had friends who took photographs of them. The media took photographs, and he rounded up as many as he could. Hardly any were convicted. Nobody of anything connected with the murder. And there was some kid, 17 years old, and he's probably the only one locked up in a kid jail for a few months. And the name of that general was Leonard Wood. I found out by studying Omaha history who the fort where I took my basic training was named after. But while I was there, I didn't know who Leonard Wood was. After I finished my basic training, I went to advanced basic. I was in the infantry. The Army is the lowest in esteem in the military structure. You know, Marines are better than they are. Naval people are better. The Air Force, and at the bottom is the Army. And in the Army, the lowest part of the Army is the infantry, which I was an infantry person. The lowest rank in the infantry was rifleman. So that's what I was, a rifleman in the infantry of the Army of the United States. And when we would march, as it was called, I also played the snare drum. So I was the company drummer. I can never say that I remember a time when idleness was not a burden for me. So I would volunteer for guard duty. That was where you just walked around the perimeter of a company area. Nobody was going to break in for sure. Nobody would try to break out. So it was a part of your training. I volunteered on Sundays for KP duty. That's called kitchen police, just so I would have something to do. But here's what was written upon my completing advanced basic. Company D, 1st Battle Group, 1st Brigade, RFA training, Fort Ord, California. Date, 5 November 1959. Subject, Private Ernest W. Chambers. 2, Commanding Officer, Company E, 2nd Battalion, 355th Infantry Regiment. The text. On September 15, 1959, Private Ernest W. Chambers joined this company to complete his second 8 weeks of infantry training. From the first day of training, he has proven himself to be an outstanding soldier. This soldier has constantly demonstrated outstanding character. He has demonstrated a willingness to learn and get the job done, which is in keeping with the highest standards of the military service. During his second 8 weeks of infantry training, this company has been extremely fortunate to be able to have a soldier of Private Chambers' caliber, and as graduation time comes along, we are indeed sorry to see this young man leave, but at the same time, very happy to have had him with us. It is a well-known fact in this company that when Private Chambers does something, he gives 100% of his mental and physical energies. This attitude toward military life is indeed most commendable. I highly recommend promotion for this soldier. I would do it myself, but regulations prohibit it. Respectfully yours, Marshall A. Burdick, Captain, Infantry, Commanding. Nobody would believe that a letter like that was written about me because I don't love the flag. I don't love this country. I don't love the things that have been done to us in this country. And if we would make an analogy, a woman who would love a sadistic man or a man who would love a sadistic woman has some mental issues. And I do not love those who have murdered my forebears, who have raped my forebears, who have treated them worse than cows, pigs, and chickens, who bred them like livestock, who sold them, who went thousands of miles over sea to capture them like you would a wild beast, destroyed any culture, anything they had that bespoke humanity, and treated them worse than they did domesticated animals. You see, in philosophy, there are human beings and subhuman beings. Human beings are classified as Homo sapiens, the wise, upright ones. But when Black people were brought to America, to use a philosophical term which was never applied by the philosophers, a tertium quid came into existence. That's a bit of Latin. A third something. It was neither human because it was not intelligent enough or endowed with enough humanity to be a human being. It was not a beast because it partook of enough of the human to lift it out of the kingdom of thingdom. And the flag that represents those who did this to us is supposed to mean something to me other than a symbol of my oppression. And I said on the floor of the legislature, when you can persuade a Jew who knew what the Holocaust was, either old enough to have been around when it happened, or scholarly enough to have read about it and come to an understanding of what it constituted, when you can persuade such a Jew to honor the swastika, you might can talk to me about honoring this rag. You'll never persuade me to do that. I don't care what anybody else does for anything. When the lady who had more dignity than everybody on that bus and more dignity in her little finger than all the races, from the cops through the governor, took her off a bus to take her to jail. She evinced more dignity because she had more dignity than all of those perpetrators and co-conspirators. I've mentioned this before. She got on the bus. They would stop and let us get on the bus because they wanted that money from everybody they could get. And she walked through that bus until she was behind the sign that said colored. She knew what the rules were. As degrading, demeaning, dehumanizing as they were, she knew what the rules were. That's where she lived. And one thing nature has inculcated in all of her children is the survival instinct. And as Khrushchev said, when Francis Gary Powers and that U-2 spy plane was shot down and did not bite into the cyanide capsule and commit suicide, as those in this Christian country directed that he should do, and they were irate and wondered why Gary Powers behaved in such a way. Oh God, this Khrushchev, the communists explained to them, living things want to go on living. This lady, whose name I have not mentioned, but I will now, Rosa Parks, was a living not thing, a living, not creature, but a living human being with thoughts, emotions, feelings, and even dignity, which was shredded every time she came in contact with these so-called superior beings. So playing by their Christian rules, their dehumanizing rules, she walked down the aisle, looking neither to the left nor to the right, making eye contact with nobody, and took her seat. As the bus proceeded, more white people got on. And when the seats in front of the sign that said colored were full, you know what those racist dogs did? They detached the sign and moved it farther from the front and closer to the very rear of the bus. And those seats in front of the colored sign, in which Black people could not sit because they would contaminate them, all of a sudden the seats in which Black people had sat already were not contaminated because these racist white people wanted to sit their rumps down. Well, Rosa Parks had played by the rule. And I imagine she said inwardly, you pushed me to my limit. I'm not going to let you take the last shred from me. You can do your worst, but I'm not moving. So you know what the brave bus driver did? Call the police. Some of these brave cops, who, as I said before, in the legislature, will say now, are our ISIS, took her off that bus, and she was charged with a crime. I don't know if those devils at that time were the flag symbols, but they were operating under the aegis of the American flag. Took her to a courtroom where they would have had an American flag and a Confederate flag, charged her with an offense, and in effect converted her into a criminal because she dared exercise the prerogative of a human being. They created a criminal. And I'm supposed to honor that rag. And when I said it, it was broadcast all over the country because I got hateful letters from all kinds of people calling me some of everything which white people know how to do. But you know something? I would go to the store in Lincoln. I would go from the parking lot to the building, and not one white man confronted me. Not one. But there were white men's voices that would come through the telephone and curse out the Black woman who answered the phone. And if they hated me, she hadn't done anything. That's how brave they are. When they lie and wait and hide from an unoffending, I guess to them, though, a dangerous creature like a duck. So from ambush, from hiding, they're armed and the quarry is not. They're brave. As Malcolm X said, when he was talking about how these people went into Vietnam, they're brave when they've got bombs. They're brave when they've got tanks. They're brave when they got a lot of company along with them. But when it's one-on-one, it's different. He said, when you turn that little man in Vietnam loose in the jungle with a blade, that's all you need is a blade. And when the sun went down and it was dark, it was even Steven. And they were driven out of Vietnam. They went into Afghanistan against people who had no Air Force, no army to speak of, unoffending against this country in any way. And now there's evidence to indicate that Osama bin Laden, who was instrumental in driving the Soviets out of Afghanistan, had nothing to do with the planning or the carrying out of that horrendous crime committed in this country on September 11th. There were innocent people in those buildings. Nobody in those buildings had done anything that would justify what was done when those buildings were blown up. I don't think every member of a group becomes inhuman because the leaders of that group manifest inhumanity. I don't believe the innocent ever ought to suffer for the guilty or with the guilty. I don't believe that the verse in the Bible should be a guide for justice, where the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. The fathers have offended to such an extent that the punishment will be visited on the children down to the third and fourth generation. What kind of God is that? A God of the Nazis? They were being very Christian when they did what they did. But at any rate, I served in that military. It was an unpleasant duty that I carried out. I said it's going to be like Bilbo hopscotch. Where am I going with this? I'm leading. There's a song where he leads me, I will follow. But you can turn this off whenever you want to. I don't know whether anybody's listening or not. And frankly, Clark Gable has said in a movie, but I don't use that kind of language. Frankly, I don't give a wag of a puppy dog's tail. That's not what he said because he's a Christian. This article is dated March 30th, 2018. Americanism bill pulled from committee. Debate this session is uncertain. By Martha Stoddard of the Omaha World Herald. I had typed 2 comments along the bottom of this article. Quote, you cannot survive if you do not know the past. That was by Oriana Fallaci, Italian journalist whose years of life were 1929 to 2006. Quote, while we read history, we make history. George William Curtis, American author-editor, 1824-1892. The article, I'll stamp it right through it. Lawmakers voted to pull a bill out of committee Thursday that would make Nebraska students take the same civics test given to would-be citizens. She argued that the measure is needed to update a law originally written in 1949 to counter trends that she said threaten American democracy. When they say she, they're talking about the introducer. Opponents argued that the proposed civics test would not develop the skills in civil discourse and critical thinking that are necessary for students to become good citizens. They're not to do any critical thinking. They're not to engage in civil discourse. They're to engage in the kind of claptrap going on now, thanks to Trump, who legitimatized it for a lot of people, and the ignoramuses who have put the letters CRT, critical race theory, on the teaching of history as it actually occurred. That's what they want, so that they don't have to come to grips with what has been done by their forebears in this country. And their idiocy and stupidity of today is going to embarrass their descendants. And they're going to wonder, how could they be such fools? Quote, this test is the dumbest way to do that, unquote, said Senator Adam Moorfield of Lincoln. Quote, it's going to be another mindless memorization exercise, unquote. Omaha Senator Ernie Chambers promised to fight the bill if it comes up for debate. He said he would talk about the darker chapters of United States history, including the enslavement of African Americans, the repeated breaking of treaties with Native American tribes, and the wartime internment of Japanese Americans. I read their history. My degree is in history at Creighton. They didn't talk about slavery. They didn't talk about the internment of the Japanese. They didn't talk about the broken treaties with the Native Americans. They talked about white history, which was pablum. But Senator Tom Brewer of Gordon, an Army veteran who served in Afghanistan, argued in favor of LB 1069, and he's a Native American. He said he hopes that learning about civics and history would help students understand the sacrifices of veterans and be more willing to serve in the military themselves. There was nothing I read in history that made me go to the war in the Army. If I went by what I remember most in school, I would not have joined, but I would have been like Trump. I would have stood up like Muhammad Ali and I said, I'm not going. Put me in jail, whatever you want to do, because you tried to destroy my mind when I was a child, and you portrayed me when I was a small child, had feelings that were hurt, when the one doing it knew that I didn't know how to fight and couldn't fight, and portrayed me as little black Sambo while the little white kids were allowed to laugh. That was the history that they gave me. And I also learned objective lessons, object lessons, experiential lessons from the white kids in the class and the white teacher who was the perpetrator. My parents taught me to respect everybody, and especially the teacher, because the teacher was going to teach me things, but where they fell down on the job. They taught me about respect, but they didn't warn me about what the teacher would do to me. But anyway, Senator Bob Christ of Omaha, who introduced a similar bill in the past, said he has had a change of heart since then. He said he now believes local school districts should be the ones deciding whether or how to use the civics examination rather than have it mandated in state law. But Speaker of the Legislature, Jim Shearer of Norfolk, said he doesn't know if the measure will come up for debate this year. Lawmakers have 4 days left to debate bills that are at the first stage of consideration, and there are several contenders for that time, and they know what I will do. I can take 4 days if I've got laryngitis and a sore throat. Legislative Bill 1069, introduced by State Senator Lydia Brosh of Bancroft, would update state laws regarding the teaching of Americanism and civics in K-12 schools. She's from the Ukraine. And when I found out about that, because she was very racist in some of the things she did, such as this, and talking about Americanism, I said, I didn't know whether she knew it or not, but at her age, she'd have to know that in the death camps, especially Auschwitz, the Ukrainians were the guards. And they had a Treblinka 1 and a Treblinka 2. Treblinka 1 was where the Jews had to mine stones from quarries. They had to do very heavy labor to help produce war material for the Nazis. And Treblinka 2 was where they exterminated Jews. And she said she wishes that I wouldn't have brought that up. I said, I wish you wouldn't bring up this Americanism. Well, America's a great country. That's why I came here. I said, well, the history of Ukrainians is known and it ought to be taught. And I'm sure people on this floor don't know anything about it. And it's my responsibility to teach them. So when I point out what the Nazis did and say that when you can persuade a Jew who's familiar with the Holocaust to honor the swastika, you can talk to me about trying to get me to honor the American flag. That's the way I operated. Not with a lot of company, never ran and hid, never had in-person backing, even from the people in this community. When I was attacked, because I said the police are my ISIS, ministers didn't back up the truth of what I said. No teachers, not Ben Gray, naturally not Brenda Council, not Brenda's brother. See what Mayor Stockwood is doing now is she is recycling these black male failures like Ben Gray and former Chief Warren. And they are dutiful. They are dutiful indeed. To complete this article, the bill would require all 8th grade and 11th grade students to take the 100-question civics examination given to immigrants seeking citizenship in the United States. You know what you have to do to pass the test? Since it's printed and you know that you're going to have to take it, by the time the kids reach this stage of their education, they know that if I can get the questions in advance and study them, I'll get 100. And the questions are just words. It can be rote learning, and they're multiple choice. And you mean to tell me that by the time these kids reach the 11th grade, they cannot have mastered the answers to a series of questions, 10 of them, that are given to immigrants who want to become citizens? How dumb do you think these white kids are? Or maybe you want to be sure that they can pass, huh? The test would not be required for graduation, but aggregate results would have to be reported to the state, and individual results would be shared with parents. The bill stalled in the Education Committee, with 3 members voting to advance it to the full legislature, 4 against advancing, and 1 abstaining. But the legislature, by a majority vote, pulled it from the committee, came to the floor of the legislature. And it was offered several times. And I don't know if we discussed it that year, but I had a field day every time because I taught them some American history. And I challenged them, prove anything that I say is wrong. And I'm not going to be angry at you. I will thank you for having improved my education. I learned from anything and anybody. Listen to this. Oh, and I buy books and read them. This is from a book called The Republic for Which It Stands, the United States During Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, 1865 to 1896. And this is a paragraph that deals with a very famous statement. The doctrine of a, quote, white man's government, unquote, was a sibling of deceased Chief Justice Roger Taney's ruling in the Dred Scott decision that black men were, quote, beings of an inferior order. By the way, he was a Roman Catholic. Of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. The Chief Justice of the United States of America, who had taken an oath to uphold the law. And this is how he interpreted the law. And he interpreted it in a way that white Christians love. And being a Roman Catholic and imbued with Catholicism and the teachings, and one of the practices of Catholicism was to burn people alive at the stake if they disagreed with the tenets of the church. Or if it happened to have been a woman that a priest tried to marry and she resisted. So to merely say that black men were so inferior they had no rights that a white man was bound to respect, what is that? Nothing to a Roman Catholic, and nobody in the church objected. The last sentence that followed. That infamous sentiment, Stevens, the one who wrote this, said with characteristic bluntness, had, quote, damned the late Chief Justice to everlasting fame, and I fear to everlasting fire, unquote. The upholders of white men's government risk the same fate. These white historians know what white people are about, and they wrote the histories. There was what was called a civil war in this country. And there were white people who would dodge going to war and there were white men who sent their slaves to war in their stead. I'm going to scurry right through this because my time is running out. As late as August 15, 1864, when victory was well on its way for the Union, Lincoln was still forced to defend his use of Negroes as soldiers. In an interview with John T. Mills, he said, quote, "The slightest knowledge of arithmetic will prove to any man that the rebel armies cannot be destroyed by Democratic strategy, Democratic Party strategy. It would sacrifice all the white men of the North to do it. There are now in the service of the United States nearly 150,000 able-bodied colored men." Did you all know that? In the Army of the Union, and they made the difference. Let me read though. 150,000 able-bodied colored men, most of them under arms, defending and acquiring the Union territory. The Democratic strategy demands these forces be disbanded and that the masters be conciliated by restoring them to slavery. The black men who now assist Union prisoners to escape are to be converted into our enemies in the vain hope of gaining the goodwill of their masters. We shall have to fight two nations instead of one. You cannot conciliate the South, said Lincoln, if you guarantee to them ultimate success. And the experience of the present war proves their success is inevitable if you fling the compulsory labor of millions of black men into their side of the scales. Will you give our enemies such military advantage as to ensure success and then depend on coaxing, flattery, and concession to get them back into the Union? Abandon all the posts now garrisoned by black men. Take the 150,000 men from our side and put them in the battlefield or cornfield against us, and we would be compelled to abandon the war in 3 weeks. I've told these ignorant white people on the floor of the legislature that I read their history. They couldn't believe that black men were the balance of power in the Civil War, and had they been taken out of the Union Army and the land that they won and were holding for the Union given up, the Union would have had to abandon the battlefield in 3 weeks. And I'm supposed to walk around with my head down, not look a white man in the eye. I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to go into this more in detail when I got time to elaborate on it. But there's a part of something that I want to discuss. I feel sorry for white women. They have been so degraded and demeaned by white men. I always have been taught that marriage is a voluntary arrangement and both parties have to agree. But the standard question that the racists in the South who know their women would always ask to anybody who wanted to do away with segregation, would you want your daughter to marry one? Well, nobody could make her marry against her will, but they raised their daughters. They have raped black women and black girls. And they thought that by denaturing these black women and black girls and debasing them, they may have put some of that knowledge in these white women and girls, and they wanted some of that brown and black sugar for themselves. So the question was, do you want your daughter raped by a black man? Because black men were not raping white women. That was always a lie. Do you want your daughter to marry one? Do you want her voluntarily to stand in front of this preacher, listen to the mumble jumble? Then when the preacher looked at her and said, do you take this black man to be your lawful wedded husband? Expected her to say yes. So to keep that from happening, don't even let her get near these black men because she finds them irresistible. That's what you white men were telling me. That's what you told me about your women. But in the way that you degraded us, I felt you were degrading your own women, but I didn't think you would degrade your mama like that, your wife like that. your daughter like that. So it told me how corrupt, how perverted white men were. And that's why they could take a pregnant black woman and hang her by the neck and then grab her body above the bump, as they call it, and pull down until the fetus emerged. Then if there was any life in it, they crush its head with their boots. That was written about. They loved that. And naturally there'd be blood flowing, and that seemed to infuriate them. And when they set the fire beneath her, the smell of the burning flesh and the burning blood drove them into a frenzy. They photographed these things. They put them on postcards. They cut parts of her body like they did men, put them in jars of formaldehyde, and put them on the mantelpieces in their houses. These things were written about by white people. That's what you told me about you and your kind. But I know that there is no entire group of people who could be that vicious, that brutal, that animalistic. And I knew some white kids, male and female, who were not anything like that. So I wondered about these women in the South. What's the matter with them? Had some white men laid down with animals, impregnated them, and given birth to the white women, so they were part animal? That's what white men did to their women. And they still degrade and debase them now. And they wanted to attack the Taliban because they said that these men would harm women's rights. But 20 years ago, when America got in this quagmire, how were women being treated? What, have you heard of the women's movement? Well, that's because white women were rebelling against the way white men mistreated them. So if America was justified into going into Afghanistan and killing people because they denied women their rights, women in this country should have been justified in killing white men, poison their food, run over them in cars. This is an insane society. But I play by the rules whenever I voluntarily enter a game, and I'm not going to stay beyond my time. So I'm Ernie Chambers, and I say what the canary said when the door to his cage was left open: I'm out of here.